Gary Moir. He's had a career in broadcasting that spans more than 50 years, includes his work at CBC Radio and several other private radio and television stations. He is currently involved with CJNU Nostalgia Radio here in Winnipeg. He served as a correspondent for Maclean's Magazine, a contributor to Time Magazine, and broadcasting instructor at Red River Community College. Gary's written extensively about the early days of radio broadcasting in Manitoba, including a book titled On the Air, The Golden Age of Manitoba Radio. And if there's anything else you'd like to add?
That's great. Thank you. Oh, thanks very much for inviting me. I think this is my third time here now, so I guess I'm getting to be a little bit old hat. But it's always a real pleasure to come out and chat with you. I always enjoy it very, very much. Under the topic of shameless self-promotion, I will start by noting that I did bring along some copies of my book tonight. If anybody is interested, I know that in the past quite a few of you have already bought copies, but if you're looking for that perfect Christmas gift or something like that, just have a chat with us after the presentation, and we'll try to help you out. So that's the commercial over. And every time it seems that I come and talk to you, I always start by saying that how important it was the amateur radio operators who really laid the groundwork for the development of commercial radio and public radio and everything else. And that's absolutely true, and tonight my presentation is not going to be any exception, I guess. So I hope that this isn't a history presentation that bores you too much. I'll try to give it a bit of a different twist and maybe make it a little bit more interesting than some of the things that even we've done in the past. And I don't know if any of you are aware or not, you likely are, that there is a book out, and it is titled Winnipeg 1912. And it was written by a local author named Jim Blanchard. He recently just passed away, as a matter of fact. It's a very, very good book, and I certainly would recommend you give it a read. And what it is, it's really the story of Winnipeg emerging as one of the great cities in this country and in North America. Chicago of the North, of course, is what they used to call it. And in 1912, Winnipeg's economy was booming. It was a transportation center for both rail and indeed water to some degree. Big money was being made in the grain industry at that point. The real estate market was just growing by leaps and bounds. Great houses were being built on places like Roslyn Road and Armstrong's Point and Wellington Crescent, and the Roslyn Apartments down on Osborne is one example of that that's still standing, as a matter of fact. And also the social scene was extremely important. Who was at your party or whose party you were invited to was very, very important, and also making sure that your daughters met the right kind of man was a very big deal in the Winnipeg social scene, or at least part of the social scene in 1912. And as I said, very good book. And Blanchard tells the story very, very well. The one thing he neglected, however, was another development that happened in the year 1912 that I would argue anyway has lasting significance to this very day. Because that was the year that the word wireless became a household name. And prior to that date, this idea of sending sound over the airwaves was not something that very many people really thought about. The word wireless was certainly not part of everyday vocabulary, and so that's the first thing. And secondly, I'm going to try to make the point that in 1912, the groundwork was really laid for the future development of wireless technology locally here in Manitoba. And of course that paved the way for amateur radio and commercial radio and public radio and even the mobile devices that we all seem to have today. So the beginnings were very, very humble indeed. But three events occurred in 1912 that really got things rolling, in my mind anyway. And two of them were here in Winnipeg, and the other was thousands of miles away, but it had a very significant impact locally. and that, of course, was the sinking of the Titanic. Now let's just turn back before I get too far ahead of myself a couple of years, because in previous presentations I've told you the story about the first wireless broadcast in Western Canada. It happened in Winnipeg in the year 1910, and this American inventor and businessman named Lee DeForest came to Winnipeg, and he did a demonstration of how you could send sound over the airwaves. And I'm going to let an old member of your organization now, a very old member, the late George Reynolds, tell that story. Let's listen.
Well, what happened in Winnipeg was that Dr. Lee DeForest, the inventor of the radio tube that was used in radios for many, many years, up to the advent of the transistor, had come to Winnipeg early in April 1910 with the intention of putting on a two-way radio telephone broadcast. Now, his party was registered at the Royal Alexander Hotel, and he made an arrangement with Eaton's to be on the other end of this two-way radio telephone conversation. Unfortunately, DeForest found that one of his sets of receiving apparatus had been damaged during the shipment from New York, so he was only able to put on a one-way demonstration. The transmitter was in the Royal Alexander Hotel. The receiver was in Eaton's store. The first, in fact, the only broadcast he made was on the morning of April the 19th, 1910. And, of course, there was a large crowd on hand at Eaton's store to witness the demonstration. And the first man to don the headphones to hear the voice of DeForest was the then mayor of Winnipeg, Sanford Evans.
Now, that was from a CBC broadcast very many years ago. I think that George Reynolds was, as a matter of fact, was one of the first, or the very first members of the Winnipeg Amateur Radio Club. But in any event, DeForest certainly did not come to Winnipeg out of the goodness of his heart. As I said, he was a businessman. And in fact, he was, I don't exactly know how to describe him, maybe a bit of a shady character who always seemed to be getting sued for something or being accused of stealing other people's patents and that type of thing. And then you tack on a number of ex-wives and girlfriends that were after him, so he really was quite a character. Anyhow, DeForest was looking to raise capital. That's the reason he came here. He wanted to raise money. And he promised Winnipeg that Winnipeg was going to be the center of this wireless technology industry, not only for Western Canada, but for the Midwest U.S. And he even took out a full-page ad in the local newspaper talking about all the wonderful things that he intended to do. There would be factories making equipment, there would be towers set up, lots of jobs, and of course business and civic leaders ate it all up. They thought this was wonderful. And what happened? Absolutely nothing. DeForest left town, was never heard from again. At least he was never heard from again in Winnipeg. But that visit in 1910 did have one impact that was quite lasting, because it tweaked the imagination of a group of young men who began to get involved in wireless technology on their own. And they began to experiment. They would make their own radio sets, wireless radio sets out of copper wire and this and that. And the parts they would either order or scavenge or whatever they could get. And most of the information was obtained from American magazines and catalogs. So what you had then by 1911 were some, and this is interesting, by 1911 there were some really strange things going on in the city of Winnipeg. People didn't quite know what to make of it. And a lot of the strange stuff was happening on the roofs of houses. There were towers popping up in every direction. One was at 94 Cathedral Avenue. And one could only imagine what the neighbors thought it was doing to property values. But you had big towers up. You had wires going in every direction. And as I said, there was one on Cathedral, 94 Cathedral. There was one at 819 McMillan Avenue. There was one on Spence Street, and a few smaller houses around the city. And what these towers were trying to do, obviously, was to catch sound coming in over the airwaves. And these young men were the first in Winnipeg to experiment in the world of wireless, and they would become very, very influential indeed, some of them. And if it's, by way of an aside here, if any of you want to see some photos of these towers and stuff that were up in 1911, 1912 Winnipeg, the old Manitoba Free Press did a feature on it, and all this is online now, of course. So if you go to November 18th, 1911, and you can see a number of the photos of these various towers and strange-looking things on tops of roofs of houses in Winnipeg. What also happened in late 1911 was the formation of something called the Canadian Central Wireless Radio Club. It was the first of its kind in Canada. And according to a newspaper article, and I'll quote now, the Winnipeg Club is headquarters for all amateur wireless radio organizations in Canada and has, in addition to its city membership, a good enrollment of out-of-town members who contribute 50 cents a year, and they receive advice and instruction. So it's a pretty good deal.
You remember those days, Dick?
This was 1911, so 1912 was the first full year that this club operated as a formal organization. Now, tied to that, these young guys doing this experimenting and forming a club, something that was very important in the world of amateur radio was also happening, and that was the opening of Kelvin Technical School. And wireless became part of the curriculum at Kelvin. And by all accounts, Kelvin really became a hotbed for amateur wireless radio activity. In fact, a radio club was formed there, and it was the first school that actually got involved with sending music over the airwaves. That was a few years later, though, than 1912. Now, there was also another school called the Central Collegiate, and I am not, I think that turned into Daniel Mack, I believe that. Maybe some of you know better than me. But Central Collegiate was also involved in wireless radio activity, and again, all of this was happening in the year 1912. So what you had in Winnipeg at that point in time was a small group of young men experimenting with wireless. They were amateurs, amateur radio. They were even called hams at that point. You also had a formal organization where if you were interested, you could go for advice. And there were also a couple of schools that were offering instruction in the world of wireless. So things were starting to develop. But it was still very, very much a niche hobby. It was a very small group of people. And I read that the Wireless Radio Club, for example, had only 12 members in Winnipeg. They were all young men, some of them teenagers, as a matter of fact. And the other thing about them is they're all young men who had money, because it wasn't necessarily a terribly cheap thing to get into. So it was a fairly expensive undertaking. But still, if you had gone down Main Street, Portage Avenue, and asked people what they knew about wireless radio, they probably would not have known what you were talking about. It just wasn't part of their everyday life. People were still traveling by horse and buggy. The telephone was a luxury. And even people that did know about wireless at that time, sending sound without wires, they really couldn't see much practical use for it. But all that changed on the night of April the 12th, 1912. In the Atlantic Ocean, just off the east coast of Canada, of course, the Titanic went down. The ship was supposedly unsinkable, hit an iceberg, and sank within a matter of hours. 1,503 people dead, 706 survivors. And the Titanic happened to have one of the most sophisticated wireless telegraphy systems in the entire world. It was state of the art. A whole room on the ship was dedicated to wireless communication. It could communicate by sending telegraph signals to ships and stations on land without the use of wires. And as I said, it was cutting-edge technology. And the wireless operators on the ship that night supposedly stayed right till the bitter end, till the ship actually started going down. sending out signals to anyone who was ready to listen, begging that somebody come and help them. And here's a little bit of an interesting aside, is that the wireless operators on the Titanic, they actually didn't work for the shipping company that owned the ship. They worked for the Marconi company. Marconi at that point in time totally controlled the communications industry, top to bottom. And he would hire out these operators to the ships to run their wireless operations. And both of the operators on that ship were just kids. They were in their early 20s, younger than Andy. I mean, it was the young guys who were on the cutting edge of all of this stuff. Now, not every ship out in the sea even had a wireless telegraph at that point in time. Some did, some didn't. And when the distress signals started going out, the ships that did, you had all sorts of signals starting to fly back and forth. And of course, it didn't all stay on the right frequency, and the more people that sent signals, and it just plain started to get confusing, and they started jamming each other. And it was a real problem, and it caused even more problems and delays at that time. And before I play my next sound piece then, just by way of background, everything that was flying around that night, I want to emphasize, there were dots and dashes. It was Morse code. I mean, they weren't sending words or music or anything like that yet. There were dots and dashes, and many of these, I guess all of them were really telegraphs that were recorded on a paper or a ticker tape. And what the British Broadcasting System did a few years ago was that they developed a software program. You can read about it online. And what this software program did is it would translate these dots and dashes into actual voices, albeit computer voices, but they were actual voices. Very interesting project. And it really gives a good sense of the urgency and everything that was going on that night. And again, before we hear this, one thing to listen for is the term CQD. And some of you may have heard of it. I hadn't heard of it before, but that was the distress signal of the day. It was the Marconi company's distress signal. As I said, Marconi controlled everything, so he made up the distress signal. And apparently, only very recently, prior to the Titanic going down in 1912, had the various nations of the world agreed to the international distress signal, SOS, so you hear a little bit of both in here. But apparently most shipping companies at that time were still using CQD. I am not sure what it stands for.
Come quick distress.
Is that what it, come quick distress?
Yep.
Great, okay, well that's great.
The other one.
But in any event, here is some of the audio of that night as translated into actual voices. Let's listen.
CQD, SOS, 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 CQD, CQD. This is Titanic. 41.46 north, 50.14 west.
This is Olympic calling Titanic. Who has struck an iceberg?
This is Titanic. We have struck an iceberg. Tell captain.
Received. Okay.
CQD, CQD.
Baltic to Titanic.
SOS,
Baltic to Titanic.
SOS, SOS. This is Titanic.
This is Olympic.
This is Titanic.
This is Virginian.
SOS.
Calling Titanic.
CQD.
This is Virginia.
CQD.
Calling Titanic.
This is Titanic.
Cape Race to Virginia.
SOS.
Report to your captain.
SOS.
The Titanic has struck iceberg and requires immediate assistance.
Received. Olympic to Titanic.
CQD. SOS.
Olympic to Titanic.
This is Titanic.
Carpathia to
We
Titanic.
have struck an iceberg and are sinking.
We are coming your way.
SOS.
Coming in full speed.
CQD.
Doing 15 knots.
Received.
Frankfurt to Titanic.
Position. We are coming to you for 1.46.
Olympic to Titanic.
Titanic to Olympic. We are in collision with the bird. Sinking head down.
Virginian calling Cape Race.
For 1.46 north.
Tell Titanic.
50.
We are going to assistance.
14 west.
We are 170 miles north.
Come soon as possible.
Olympic to all stations. Virginian calling Cape Race. Olympic to all stations. This is Baltic. Stop talking. This is Baltic. Stop talking. Stop transmitting. Jamming. All stations stop talking.
Yeah, that was a problem they ran into. There was so many signals flying around that they couldn't understand each other. Now what we're going to do is we're going to fast forward a few hours then when the rescue ship Carpathia has reached the Titanic and started to pick up some of the people who were in the lifeboats. So that's coming up right away.
This is Carpathia. This is Carpathia. Titanic struck iceberg. Carpathia has passengers from lifeboats.
Can you see Titanic?
Carpathia calling all ships. Titanic foundered about 2:20 a.m. Carpathia picked up many passengers in boats.
Baltic to Carpathia. I'm returning to give assistance. We'll be there about 4:30. Have you any idea how many were lost? Did you see Titanic?
Carpathia calling all ships. The Titanic has gone down with all hands, as far as we know, with the exception of 20 boatloads, which we have picked up. Number not accurately fixed yet. We could not see any more boats about at all.
Pretty dramatic stuff. And what was happening then was that for the first time in history, this was information that was getting out in what we would call, I guess today, real time, or pretty close to real time. And imagine what it would have been like if there had been no wireless. I mean, almost certainly there would have been a much higher death toll. And from a communications point of view, though, what was really happening was a seismic shift from the past. Newspapers got the story much earlier than they ever would have been before because they were getting their information through wireless technology, sending sound over the airwaves without wires. Now, back home here in Winnipeg, there was a huge interest in the sinking of the Titanic, and as we know, I think it was a number of Manitobans died in the Titanic. Several survived. I think all the survivors were women who were from Winnipeg, 4 of them. And among the people who were killed were some of the city's most prominent citizens. A man called Hugh Ross was one, Mark Fortune was another. Men who were very influential, men who had their houses on Wellington Crescent and Roslyn Road, movers and shakers. And apparently there was also 2 other families that were heading for Winnipeg to come and live here for the very first time, but neither one of them ever made it. And every day as new details emerged, thousands, and yes, literally thousands of Winnipeggers would stand outside the newspaper offices and get whatever information they could about the disaster. And I'm going to read you a quote now from April the 17th, the Winnipeg Free Press, and here's what it says. Great crowds have surged about the bulletin boards from early Tuesday morning until after midnight. There was never a time that there was not an eager mass of people keen for the latest news. It's quite remarkable. That was just the Free Press. The same thing was happening at the Tribune and the Telegram and everything else. In fact, it's not known by a lot of people, but the Free Press and the Winnipeg Telegram actually sent reporters to New York City to cover the sinking of the Titanic. Because this was all unfolding over time, because it took a few days for Carpathia to get to New York City after picking up the passengers from the lifeboats. And the reporters gathered in New York to get the latest wireless information and wait for this ship to come in. Now, every story and most headlines at that point made reference to this word wireless, sending sound without wires. Because the only information that was coming really from across the sea or from the rescue ship was wireless that was being received in New York City. And there was dozens of references to wireless in a great many of the stories and headlines. Winnipeg Tribune headline from that date, I'll just read it. Titanic on maiden voyage meets with accident off Newfoundland coast, help summoned by wireless. And in that story alone, that front page story, I counted 13 different references to wireless technology. Another headline in the Free Press, list of survivors received by wireless. Suddenly, wireless was everywhere. It was the only game in town. So just to wrap up this section then on the Titanic, I would like to play you a little radio feature. It was done by a journalist called Paul Harvey Jr. I don't know if you've ever heard of him or not, but his father was a pioneer of radio, a great storyteller, and his son followed in his footsteps. And as I said, they were excellent storytellers. And he really sums up in about 3 minutes how this one event really changed the course of communications history. So let's listen.
David was a nobody. Born in a Russian ghetto, he immigrated to America aged 9, grew up in the slums of New York. In his teens, he found work as an office boy, then as a telegraph operator. At 21, he got a job at New York's Wanamaker department store. On the top floor, the store had installed what was being called the world's most powerful radio station. David was the station's telegrapher, but he was still a nobody until the night of April 14, 1912. Over the radio receiver, he's listening to the usual patter of telegraphic dots and dashes when his keen young ears detect something in the background, something faint and far away and engulfed in static. It's a telegraphic message from a ship, the SS Olympic, 1,400 miles at sea, and the message is repeating. SS Titanic ran into iceberg, sinking fast. The young man can scarcely believe what he's hearing. The much celebrated British ocean liner, epitome of luxury, boldly labeled unsinkable, is going down on its maiden voyage, and David is the first person on land to know. He fumbles for the telegraph transmitter key and signals to the Olympic at sea, message received, transmit details, and with his free hand he reaches for the telephone, notifies the press. Shortly, the streets below are inundated with hastily prepared newspaper extras, their headlines shouting the newly discovered tragedy. Coastal radio stations and vessels in the disaster area are alerted. Soon the airwaves are jammed with the colliding signals of those wishing to help, and yet together they've only made matters worse. Now no one can hear. So President Taft is notified, and he declared that all radio transmitters are to shut down immediately, all but that one, the top Wanamakers in New York, which received the initial distress signal. That station alone will communicate with the distant icy Atlantic. So it happened that the whole anxious world turned to a young man it never knew, alone on the highest floor of a Manhattan department store, riveted to a set of earphones. Masses converged on Wanamakers, reporters, friends and relatives of those aboard Titanic, crowds of the concerned, the curious. Then police were summoned to restore quiet, otherwise the young telegraph operator would be unable to discern the names of the survivors as they were transmitted from the rescue ships. And hours became days. But David, though exhausted, was kept awake by the awareness of his enormous responsibility. Listening intently to the sporadic staccato pouring through his earphones, he ate practically nothing. And in 3 days, his lonely vigil was over. And you can imagine what else. Because as the airwaves fell silent, a new celebrity was born. And even more, the art of radio communication itself was elevated in the world's estimation from scientific curiosity to outright necessity. And that fledgling industry neither forgot nor failed to repay the man we remember as president of RCA, and later president of NBC, who would live to be revered as the father of American television, once a nobody named David Sarnoff.
Well, as I indicated, good storyteller, and there are those who will say that Sarnoff overplayed what he did, but in any event, there's absolutely no question about the impact of the event on the development of communications. So just let me sum up then. Winnipeg 1912, what you had was a group of committed amateurs, hams, young people, very interested in the world of wireless. You had the first full year of operation of a new club aimed at expanding research into wireless. You had 2 schools in Winnipeg, one called Kelvin, the other Central Collegiate, offering courses in wireless technology. And most important of all, because of the Titanic, people, the general public, saw the value of sending sound over the airwaves. And as I indicated previously, a year early, people probably would not even have known what it was that you were talking about. So, the stage was set for the development of radio, whether it's amateur radio, shortwave radio, commercial radio, public radio. What happened next? The stage was set. What happened after that? Well, the First World War broke out, and all amateur radio was banned by the federal government. They didn't want a repeat of sounds getting jammed if the military was trying to send information. But the military saw wireless as a very important tool, and they went to work and they did a whole bunch of research and development, and great strides were made in improving wireless technology. And a great number of those young guys from Manitoba that we talked about ended up as wireless operators on ships and land stations during the war. And this is Remembrance Day week, and indeed a good many of them did not come back. But for those who did, and among the wireless people who did come back were people like, I don't know if these names mean anything to you or not, but Alex Pollock, Ralph Foster, Lynn Salton, Darby Coates, Graham Spry, and others. And these were the people who would lead the way in the development of local amateur radio and public radio and commercial radio and on and on and on. And when 1919, and I just want to make one last thing before I wrap it up here. In the year 1919, one of the first things that happened after the war was over and the ban was lifted was the formation of the Winnipeg Amateur Radio Club in 1919. And somebody had asked me about this history-wise before, and the first reference I have ever been able to find to the club, and if you want to jot it down if you're interested, was in the Winnipeg Tribune in 1922, April the 20th, and they talk a bit about the formation of the Winnipeg Amateur Radio Club at that time. So, just to sum up then, when we sit down tonight and either check our mobile devices or we sit down in front of our radios, I think that we can trace the roots of that all the way back to 1912. Thanks very much.